I swear to God, if I put as much time and energy into my dissertation at uni as I have into Sarah J Maas's books, I would be unstoppable right now. So back in 2020, I read House of Earth and Blood, very quickly became obsessed, made a ton of content on it. I'm still making content on it at this point. I cannot be stopped. But when I read it and made all of those videos, there was one comment on one of those videos that I have tried to find and I've been unsuccessful to this point, which asked whether I noticed a possible connection between House of Earth and Blood and ACOTAR, which I didn't at the time. So when I went into my reread very recently, I decided to pay attention to elements that might tie to ACOTAR. Now there is theories of a extended Maas universe. There is theories of a crossover between all three of her series. So in this video, I'm going to be presenting to you guys a whole ton of evidence using House of Earth and Blood as my base of reference, because this is the book that I read with the multiverse, or whatever you want to call it, in mind, supporting, maybe disproving that all of these worlds are connected, that one is a prequel to another, that there's going to be a possible crossover. So as I've only read this one recently, a lot of the references I have to ACOTAR and Throne of Glass and specific quotes and information I've pulled from the Throne of Glass and the ACOTAR wikis, because at this point, like, I read A Court of Silver Flames last year, but up until that point, the last time I read an ACOTAR book was in 2018, and the last time I read Throne of Glass was 2018 as well, so that's 4 years ago now. I cannot access those memories from my brain for like specific details. So my references to House of Earth and Blood have been lifted from the text. ACOTAR and Throne of Glass, I've been researching on the wikis and a whole ton of stuff. Like, it took me hours to compile the information for this, and every time I looked up a specific point, I found something else that may be relevant. So we're going to start off with all of the evidence, and then I'm going to talk about what I actually think, how I think everything ties together, thoughts of possible crossovers, prequels, all of that kind of stuff. Now, I do want to put two blanket statements right at the beginning of this video. The first is that I am filming this video just before the release of House of Sky and Breath, because I do know there is potential for this video to be watched in 2-3 years when more books are published and people to comment and tell me all of the reasons why I'm wrong. So at this point, I only have the information that is available to me, which is everything up to House of Sky and Breath, which I have not read yet. The second blanket statement is that in this video, I'm going to be spoiling every single book that Sarah J Maas has ever wrote, aside from the Catwoman Soul Stealer book, which has got nothing to do with her original work. It was part of like a different thing. If you have not read everything, you may not want to watch this video. I will say that I don't think I'm spoiling big plot points for Throne of Glass, but it has been 4 years since I read it, so there could be things that were big plot reveals and I just don't remember them being such a big deal. But I'm mainly referring to the history and the lore of the world. There aren't really any main Throne of Glass characters mentioned in here at all. It's more historical stuff, but I am going to be spoiling a lot of major plot points for ACOTAR and probably a whole ton of stuff for House of Earth and Blood as well. I think the main thing I'm spoiling here is ACOTAR, but just be warned, if you haven't read everything and you don't want to be spoiled, then you may not want to watch this video. I would also like to clarify as well that the information that I have in this video is probably not all of the information out there that can connect all of the series. It's just what I personally picked up on when reading House of Earth and Blood, and to be honest, we already have a lot to go on with just what's present in this video. So getting straight into this multiverse theory, we already know that there is a connection between them. We already know that they are adjoining worlds, and we've known this since 2018 when Kingdom of Ash was released. So in 2018, House of Earth and Blood hadn't been released, but it is referenced in Kingdom of Ash. So I have the direct quote here. It says, "She passed through a world where a great city had been built along the curve of a river, the buildings impossibly tall and glimmering with lights," which is a reference to House of Earth and Blood. And then she passed through a world of snow-capped mountains under shining stars, passed over one of those mountains where a winged male stood beside a heavily pregnant female, gazing at those very stars. Fae. Now, we knew at the time that this was a reference to ACOTAR, it's a reference to recent Feyre, and this instance is also referenced in A Court of Silver Flames. Now, we do have further confirmation that there are multiple aspects of the world and the universe throughout the entirety of House of Earth and Blood, really, but a lot of it comes from Adis, who is one of the demon princes of Hell. So when Bryce summons him in House of Earth and Blood, he says, "The Northern Rift opens to other places, other realms, yes, but other planets as well. What is Hell but a distant planet bound to yours by a ripple in space and time?" He follows that up with, "Your kind, the Fallen, were made in Midgard by the Asteri, but the Fae, the Shifters, and many others came from their own worlds. The universe is massive. Some believe it has no end, or that our universe might be one in a multitude, as bountiful as the stars in the sky or the sand on a beach." So Adis is essentially saying, like, yes, you all came from other places, possibly Aurelia, or Prythian. But he's also saying that the universes could essentially be infinite, so while they came from other places, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a direct reference to either Throne of Glass or ACOTAR. Now, in every series, they do have a way to open portals and travel between worlds, which is how we ended up with the Kingdom of Ash Easter egg anyway. So in Throne of Glass, we have the word gates, and on the Throne of Glass wiki, it says about the word gates that they are a black area cut through the word, the foundation of Aurelia and all worlds in the Megaverse. It is capable of opening portals into different worlds or destroying them altogether. The word gates open randomly or with the use of word keys. Interdimensional creatures like gods can enter and leave through these gates. It is also possible to make word gates, like when Queen Maeve created a word gate just so that she could escape her husband Orcus from the Valg world. In ACOTAR, there's possibly a couple of ways that they could open portals in that world, but in A Court of Silver Flames, we discovered the Dread Trove, and part of that Dread Trove is the harp. The ACOTAR wiki says about the harp that it is a small golden harp capable of opening portals to different locations and realities, as well as altering one environment, such as trapping Fae into stone to form the prison. And of course, in House of Earth and Blood, we have the Lunar Horn, which used to be an ancient Fae relic. I mean, it still is, but it was ground into powder, mixed with witch ink, and is now in the form of the tattoo on Bryce's back. The Fae made the Lunar Horn in their own world, brought it with them in the Crossing, which is when all the portals opened and the Vanir entered the world, and they used it to battle the demon horde. So in House of Earth and Blood, we definitely know that the Fae came from somewhere else. All of the Vanir, aside from the angels like Hunt, came from a different world, because Adis confirms that the only creature that is native to the world of Crescent City are the humans that were there originally and the angels that were made by the Asteri. So some things that we found out in House of Earth and Blood about the Crossing and the Fae is that there were multiple Starborn, not one like everybody kind of assumes. There was more than just Prince Peleus, meaning that theoretically they could have come from the Night Court, because what we see in Prythian especially is that Fae with the same kind of powers are bound to things like the court and they stick to the same locations. So theoretically all of the Starborn could have come from somewhere like the Night Court, where they would have powers like shadows and starlight. In the world of House of Earth and Blood, there are 7 Fae Kings in total, like there are 7 High Lords of Prythian. Aside from being Starborn, Rune also has powers of mist and shadow, which come from the Fae of Avalon, which is very reminiscent to the Night Court to me. But the King of Avalon is called the Stag King, which sounds like it could possibly be a reference to Throne of Glass and Terrasen. Now, while we're talking about Rune, I feel like he is one of the most integral characters when it comes to tying together all of these theories. When talking about Rune's power, House of Earth and Blood says, Rune claimed Rune's magic was more like those of his kin who ruled the sacred Isle of Avalon across the sea. Power to summon shadow or mist that could not only veil the physical world, but the mind as well, perhaps even telepathy. Now that may sound a little bit familiar to you, because it sounds a lot like Azrael's powers. So Azrael, one of the Inner Circle, he's a shadow singer, and the wiki for Azrael says, as a shadow singer, he has the predisposition to hear and feel things others can't. He can merge into shadows and move throughout them, which is exactly what Rune does. However, shadow singers in the ACOTAR world are extremely rare, and Azrael is currently the only living shadow singer, whereas in House of Earth and Blood, there's a whole island of those Avalon Fae that have similar powers to him. So something else that very possibly connects Rune to ACOTAR is the sword that he has. This one is a little bit more of a reach, but it's one of those things that I noticed when I was looking up other information in the ACOTAR wiki. So the Star Sword is like the legendary sword of the Starborn. Rune went to a cave and he drew it out of its sheath, and that meant that he was the Starborn. He's the only one that could do it. Now, first off, the fact that the isle where Rune's relatives are from is called Avalon, and the way that Rune claimed the sword reminds me a lot of Arthurian legend, with Avalon sounding a lot like Avalon and Rune's sword sounding a lot like the sword in the stone. Arthurian legend is actually Welsh, and something that a lot of you guys may not notice if you're not from the UK is that the map of Prythian is the map of the UK, with Highburn being Ireland and Prythian being Scotland, England and Wales. So that could possibly be a connection, because a lot of the law in ACOTAR is British, while the majority of the law in House of Earth and Blood is actually Norse. So the information that we get on the Star Sword in House of Earth and Blood is that it is the fabled dark blade of the Starborn Fae. Its black hilt devouring the glaring first lights. Isaiah had once heard someone say the sword was made from iridium, mined from a meteorite forged in another world, before the Fae had come through the Northern Rift. So this comes from another world. When I was researching into the harp, which is part of the Dread Trove, I had a quick look through all of the other items that make up the Dread Trove, one of which is a sword called Gwydion. Gwydion is a magical sword of death that belonged to the first High King of Prythian, Fionn, to free and unite unite the land from the Daglan. It's said that it was forged by the High Priestess Elena and was as dark as night. Its current location is unknown. Hello, Editing Becca here again, once again reviewing some footage and developing some theories. It has just occurred to me that the name Gwydion is also Welsh in origin, just like the legend of King Arthur. So is it possible that the Star Sword, which is supposed to have been forged in another world, is actually Gwydion, part of the Dread Trove that is currently missing and was forged in the Cauldron? And then there are also a couple of other things about Rune that maybe indicate that himself and the rest of the Fae could be tied to the ACOTAR series. One of those is that Rune's features and his colouring are very similar to those of the Night Court, like Rhysand. And also Rune's father is the Autumn King, which straight off is reminiscent of the Autumn Court in ACOTAR. But not only is he called the Autumn King, his description is very similar to the description of Lucian and Lucian's family who rule the Autumn Court, and he also has fire magic, which is the power that is associated with the Autumn Court in ACOTAR. So moving on from Rune, we have two characters, one in ACOTAR, one in House of Earth and Blood, that are very mysterious and also possibly very similar. Those are Fury Axtar in House of Earth and Blood and Amren, who is one of the members of the Inner Circle. So just going through the very few things that we know about Fury for sure. She is of an unknown species. She's of an unknown age. We kind of assume that she's around the same age as Bryce and Danica, so early mid-20s, because she went to university with them. However, Fury has already made the drop, so she looks like she's 21, but that doesn't mean that she is, and the fact that she went to university with Bryce and Danica could have been a front for a mission, because we know for sure now from House of Earth and Blood that both Bryce and Danica are extremely powerful people. And then there were a couple of very subtle things in House of Earth and Blood that led me to believe that Fury is actually a lot older than we would assume that she is, and also very, very powerful. The first thing is that she has the authority to give the Viper Queen orders, and the Viper Queen seems afraid of her and actually does what she says. And the second is that she threatens Micah and there's no repercussions for it, like nobody says anything to her. There is also something that I talked about in my House of Sky and Breath theories, the fact that when Hunt rips Sandriel's head off and his power is unleashed, Fury is in the room at the time, and the book says Fury shook slightly as if she had forgotten what he could do. Now Hunt has been a slave for 200 years, so how would Fury ever know what he could do unless she was around at the time before he was enslaved? The only other thing that we really know about Fury is that she is some sort of mercenary or assassin, and she has a lot to do with the war over in Pangira. Now moving on to the very few things that we know about Amren. One of them is that she is an unknown species. However, I do believe that Sarah J Maas kind of clarified not long after ACOTAR was released that Amren is based on an angel of death from the Old Testament. So possibly she's an angel of death, which implies that she's maybe from Midgard if angel of death is going to be like her official species title. When Nesta asked Amren what she was before she came to the ACOTAR world, Amren says she was a messenger and soldier assassin for a wrathful god in a fledgling world. Now, one of the only other things that we know about Amren is that she entered the ACOTAR world 15,000 years ago. In the books, it says that she slipped into the world when Prythian was forming, implying that Prythian is also 15,000 years old. And interestingly, the year in Crescent City is 15,030 something, and the calendar of Midgard started when the Northern Rifts opened and all of the Vinea came through, implying very possibly that the way that Amren ended up in the ACOTAR world is by going through one of these portals, the North and South Rifts, when they were all opened at the same time and all of these creatures just started pouring through into different worlds. So the reason I compared Fury and Amren side by side is that I think that they are possibly the same species. Now, we've had a kind of confirmation from Sarah J Maas that Amren is an angel of death or was based on an angel of death, and that would kind of fit with Fury given that she is in Midgard where the angels were created and where the series is largely about angels. There's also very similar reactions to the two of them. Amren is like a dark fairy tale told to fairy children to scare them because she's so powerful, and everybody seems to be terrified of Fury. They also could very possibly have similar jobs or had similar jobs when they were both in the same world. Fury is a mercenary slash assassin, but it's all very mysterious, and Amren said that she was a soldier assassin to a ruthless god in a fledgling world. There are also a couple of Easter eggs in House of Earth and Blood, which could be nothing. They could just be things for people who've read all of Sarah J Maas's books to find, and they could essentially be meaningless. But in Jessica's library under Griffin Antiquities, she has two books, one of which is from the ACOTAR series and one of which is from Throne of Glass. The first one is the Book of Breathings, which is a book from ACOTAR that was created by fairies who feared the cauldron. They made it from the last bit of ore that was used to make the cauldron, and the reason they did this is to nullify the cauldron's powers. Now, the last time we see the Book of Breathings is when Feyre gets frustrated that she can't read it and she tosses it into the void. The other book from Throne of Glass is The Walking Dead, which is a book that Selena reads that teaches her about the Ridderak, which is a type of Valg. Now, one thing that I definitely think is connecting these worlds is the demons. So in Throne of Glass they're called the Valg, in House of Earth and Blood they're just called demons and demon princes, but Adis does confirm what is hell but a distant planet bound to yours by a ripple in space and time. And then lastly, we just have a few similarities between the two things, which could essentially mean nothing, but they have been referenced in multiple series. So the first one is that the worm that Feyre slays at the end of ACOTAR is called the Midgard worm, and the planet that Crescent City takes place on is Midgard. Now, this could be a possible connection between the two, but if we actually look into the etymology of the words, Midgard is Old English and Midgard is Old Norse, and both of them mean earth. So the planet that Crescent City is in is Earth, and the worm that Feyre slays is literally translated to earthworm. Another similarity in the language is that on the southern continent in Throne of Glass there is a range of mountains called the Rune Mountains, and that is spelled R-U-H-N-N, which very obviously is similar to Rune's name in House of Earth and Blood, although his is spelled with one N. And there could be some very distant connection between those two. I mean, the Rune Mountains is relevant to the Fae in Throne of Glass, and we do know that there is a word gate there. However, it's very possible that the origin of both the Rune Mountains and Rune as a character just come from the word rune, which is R-U-N-E, and that makes even more sense when we think about Rune as a character, because the definition of rune is any of the characters of any of several alphabets used by Germanic peoples from about the 3rd to the 13th centuries, and as the predominant mythology in House of Earth and Blood is Norse, that makes a whole ton of sense. Another similarity between Throne of Glass and House of Earth and Blood is that the witches all worship the three-faced goddess, or the maid, the mother, and the crone. So when talking about the witches in House of Earth and Blood, it says the power was inherited from some ancient source that the witches claimed was a three-faced goddess, which matches up with the goddess that the three Iron Teeth clans worship in Throne of Glass. Now, in Throne of Glass, the three-faced goddess is one of 12 gods in Aurelia, becoming trapped in the world after wandering through a word gate. She is the goddess of witchcraft and magic. Now, we already know that the gods can travel through the world, and that is one of the purposes of the word gate, so it does make sense that in all of these different series there will be some gods that overlap. And the witches in Throne of Glass and Crescent City are different. In Throne of Glass, the way that the witches were created is that in the first Valg Wars, the Valg began to kidnap the Fae and they were forcing them to breed, and the union of a Fae and a Valg created one of the Iron Teeth witches. In Crescent City, it doesn't really say much about the origins of witches. It says that they tend to be in the same families, however witches can pop up anywhere, and it does say that they appear human and that their power source comes from the three-faced goddess. My best guess on this is just that the three-faced goddess has traveled between both of the worlds, causing both of the worlds to worship her, but the three-faced goddess, or the concept of the mother, the maid, and the crone, is not exclusive to Sarah J Maas anyway, and it's most likely that Sarah J Maas was inspired by the Greek goddess Hecate when she created this deity, because what it says about Hecate in mythology is that she is the Greek goddess of magic, witchcraft, the night, light, ghosts, necromancy, and the moon, and she's also associated with crossroads. All of those things match up to central themes in all three of Sarah J Maas's series. And then one other similarity that could possibly be relevant is that the bargain tattoo between Nesta and Cassian in A Course of Silver Flames takes the shape of an 8-pointed star, which is the symbol of the Asteri in Crescent City. Something else as well possibly relevant is that the theme of 3 interlocking circles is present throughout all 3 of Sarah J Maas's series. In House of Earth and Blood, Bryce has an Archesian amulet, which is described as being 3 interlocking circles. In, I think, A Court of Silver Flames, the Bone Carver is talking about his siblings, the Weaver and the Death God, who is it pronounced Kashai? And he draws 3 interlocking circles on the floor. And while the symbol is different, the Eye of Elena in Throne of Glass is made up of 2 interlocking circles inside a bigger one. So once again, 3 circles in the symbology, and the Eye of Elena is integral in opening portals. So now that I've presented you guys with all of the evidence, what does this actually mean? Now, the truth is that we can't say for sure, and the reason why I wanted to put this video out before the release of House of Sky and Breath is because there is already a lot of material here, and I wanted to present it to you guys before more is added to it, or possibly even before we get some actual concrete answers. answers. So at the moment, I can only really tell you what I think this means, and to be honest, possibly nothing. I don't even think that any of this means that there's necessarily going to be a crossover. I mainly think that it all just means something that we already knew, that is further reinforced from House of Earth and Blood, is that all of these worlds are connected throughout the lore, the history, and all of the creatures. One of the recurring theories that I've seen popping up is that maybe ACOTAR is a prequel series to Crescent City. Some of the things that I've seen leading from this is that with the way that Nesta healed Feyre in A Court of Silver Flames, bathing her in light, maybe some of that rubbed off onto the baby Nyx and started off the original line of Starborn Fae. And maybe Azriel has children later down the line, which introduces the Shadow Singer powers into different worlds. However, I definitely don't think that this is true, and I actually do have evidence to support this. Now, the main reason that I don't believe this to be true is that I believe all of the series are running consecutively, and the exact order of the events of the books is pretty much in publication order. Now, I feel like this is evidenced because in 2018, when Kingdom of Ash was released, Selena flies through many worlds, two of which are ACOTAR and Crescent City. When she passes through ACOTAR, Feyre is heavily pregnant, and in the next released installment of the ACOTAR series, Feyre is heavily pregnant, meaning that A Court of Silver Flames and Kingdom of Ash are running pretty much side by side, they're overlapping. Another thing that signals that they're all happening pretty much at the same time is that when Selena flies through Crescent City, she describes it as a great city that had been built along the curve of a river, the buildings impossibly tall and glimmering with light. What we know about Lunathian specifically on the planet of Midgard from House of Earth and Blood is that it was modelled after a historic city. The first thing that was built in the city when it was founded is the Lunar Temple, which is 500 years prior to the start of the series. So this is a world that has existed for 15,000 years. 14,500 years in is when Lunathian was founded, starting off with the building of this temple. And we know that the technology came with Micah, who wanted the city to reflect its historic origins and the city that it was modelled on, and also be kept up to date with modern technology and be a place for the future as well. Now, it doesn't say anywhere how long Micah has been the Arch-Governor, but seeing as the city was only founded 500 years prior to the start of the series, we can assume that Micah has been Arch-Governor for a little less than that time. Even if he wasn't, like, there can't be any technology without a city. So if Selena was traveling through Crescent City any earlier than that, there wouldn't have been skyscrapers and there wouldn't have been all of these glittering lights. And we know that all of the Vanir, including the Fae, entered Midgard 15,000 years ago, so a minimum of 14,500 years before there were skyscrapers and glittering lights in Crescent City, pretty much just proving that ACOTAR is a prequel to Crescent City, unless Aelin was also traveling through time. But I don't think that's true, because the only confirmation we've had of any kind of time travel is Ada saying, "What is hell but a distant planet bound to yours by a ripple in space and time?" Any other information we have implies that people are traveling through worlds, not traveling through time. And it is also important to remember that while we have all of these connections between the three series that Sarah J. Maas has written, Ada's pretty much disproves that anything is solidly connected by saying that there is an infinite amount of universes. There could be as many universes as there is grains of sand on a beach. Literally nobody knows. And at the absolute minimum, if they're all set on planets, there are 7 planets in the solar system that Midgard is in, which of course also explains why absolutely everything cannot be traced back to ACOTAR or Throne of Glass, because there's other universes, other worlds, realms and planets out there. However, saying all of that, even though throughout this the majority of the links that we have are actually between Crescent City and ACOTAR, I think that the oldest world out of the 3 is actually the Throne of Glass world, Aurelia. The reason why I believe this is that we don't have a whole ton of information about when the Fae entered the ACOTAR world, but we do know that humans have 100% existed in the ACOTAR world and in Midgard before the arrival of any other creatures. But in Aurelia, it says that the Fae have been there since the dawn of time, all of them stemming from Mora and Mab. So if I was to make a theory about where all the Fae actually came from, I think they came from Throne of Glass and they came from Mora and Mab. One of the first conflicts we know of in the Throne of Glass world is the first Valg Wars, where the Word Gates opened, all of the Valg or demons came through and they started killing and kidnapping the Fae, forcibly breeding them to make things like the Iron Teeth Witches and causing a whole ton of havoc. After the first Valg Wars, we know that a lot of Fae migrated to the southern continent, but what is to say that a lot of the Fae didn't try and escape Aurelia in this time, passing through those Word Gates that we know can open randomly. They can be forcibly opened, forcibly made, or gods can pass through them, but they do open sporadically as well. So some of the Fae could have have gone through some of those portals, and who's to say that they went directly to the world that they stayed in? It's very possible that Faye could have gone from a portal from Aurelia to Prythian and then eventually ended up in Midgard. Something that I do think is consistent throughout all of this is that the demons all come from hell. They all come from the same place, and they are all variations of demons from the same world. Now, the reason why they're called different things, I mean, all of these worlds have existed for at least 15,000 years, and we have to assume that there is going to be evolution that takes place on each individual world, which causes some of the things that are really similar to things in other series but are not exactly the same. It is possible as well that Fae are not the only creatures that originated in the Throne of Glass world, because we have characters like Lysandra in Throne of Glass, who is a very powerful shifter and also one of the only ones of her kind. Now, in the world of Throne of Glass, there have been many wars against magic, starting with the Valg Wars, and then later on we have King Cavaliard's crusade against magic, trying to get rid of it, putting a lock on it, all of that stuff. And in the process of that, a lot of shifters were trapped in their animal or human form, and it does say in Throne of Glass that if you're trapped in one form, you can lose the ability to be able to shift back. So there could be a ton of shifters in Throne of Glass that are still stuck in their animal form, so nobody knows that they actually are shifters. And if that is the case, it would make sense why we don't have a whole ton of Fae abilities represented in Throne of Glass. Like, we don't have any abilities that represent things that like the Night Court can do. And it would also make sense why we don't have a whole ton of information on the exact specifics of the magic or the Fae in Throne of Glass, because so much of their knowledge was lost either through the Valg Wars or through King Cavaliard's crusade to eliminate magic. Now, what I will say is that the confirmed history in Throne of Glass does not match up with the timelines of ACOTAR and Crescent City. The oldest character that exists in Throne of Glass is Maeve, and all we know about her is that she's at least 3,000 years old. But we do know that Mab and Mora were there before she was, so they are even older than that, and they don't exist anymore to confirm anything about themselves. All we have is legend. So while the timeline doesn't exactly match up to the 15,000 years that's confirmed with the date in Crescent City, and also when Amren crossed over into Prythian and says that at the time she crossed over, Prythian was forming, it could still match up, because all we know about the Fae from Throne of Glass is that they're supposed to have been there since the dawn of time. Nothing actually specifies when the dawn of time was. So my conclusion on what I think all of this means, I actually don't think that there's necessarily going to be a crossover. I think that what this means is that the lore is entwined, that there's an extended universe there, that everything kind of spawns from each other, but ultimately there's a whole ton of like evolution that's been done on planet, which makes them all very different. And when Sarah J Maas was releasing Crescent City, she said it's a whole new story in a whole new world, and I don't feel like she's going to do a major crossover. I will say as well that for me, I've received a lot of questions when I say I don't like Cassandra Clare because her series never end, and it seems hypocritical because I love Brandon Sanderson and Robin Hobb and Sarah J Maas, a whole ton of authors with other extended universes. But the mark of a good author with an extended universe or a multiverse for me is that having the multiverse or extended universe there adds to the reading experience, but in no way detracts from it. So all of the series should be able to be read on their own, and if you read all of them, you gain a little something extra, but you don't lose anything if you haven't read anything else. And currently, as it stands, that is what these series are. I'm gaining so much from knowing all of these things, but if I didn't know them, I would still really enjoy and really love the books. And if we have any kind of major character, even if they're like a lesser main character or a prominent side character from another series turn up in another world, like if it turns out that the second part of the ACOTAR series and Crescent City are going to be entwined, I'm probably not going to be on board for that, and I'm probably not going to enjoy it. So at the minute, I both don't believe that there's going to be a solid crossover, and I also don't want there to be a solid crossover. However, it is interesting that the ACOTAR series has returned to be published at the same time as the Crescent City series, but I will say that I have heard that A Court of Silver Flames was Sarah J Maas's comfort book that she was writing alongside House of Earth and Blood, and I feel like that's evident in A Court of Silver Flames. It's very indulgent and very like fan servicey, which to be honest, that's why A Court of Silver Flames didn't make it into my favorite books of 2021, because it feels like it's pandering to the fans, and to me that is also what a crossover would be. But it's also interesting that in the two most recent books we've had, House of Earth and Blood and A Court of Silver Flames, the characters now have access to artifacts that allow them to travel through realms, worlds, planets, whatever you want to call them. Because in ACOTAR we now have the harp, which allows people to open portals portals and travel between realms. Also a part of the Dread Trove, which possibly connects to Rune. And seeing as Bryce is literally the Lunar Horn in House of Earth and Blood, it kind of implies that an integral part of the plot of Crescent City is going to have something to do with portals, and there is a lot of content in House of Earth and Blood about worlds and the rifts opening and people coming from different worlds and traveling to different worlds. So I guess that it is possible that there is going to be a crossover, especially as there could be a possibility that looking for more information on the Starborn Fae, which I personally think is one of the biggest pieces of the Crescent City series, is going to end up leading them to Prythian. But the ACOTAR world is a lot bigger than we actually see. We have a whole continent that they don't really know much about in the ACOTAR world, so it could have something to do with that as opposed to the direct plot of ACOTAR and those characters. So I'm not necessarily saying that a crossover isn't going to happen, because we do have a couple of odd floating characters in each series. We have Dorian in Throne of Glass, who didn't get his ending wrapped up in a bow quite as neatly as everybody else did. We have Elaine in ACOTAR, who it's assumed that her book is going to be next, and it is mentioned multiple times in ACOTAR that Elaine doesn't quite seem to fit in with the Night Court. My theory with her is that she's maybe going to fit in the Spring Court, but it's also possible that she could be destined for another realm, especially as herself and Nestor were created by the Cauldron, which is supposed to be like the source of all existence and life. And then of course we have Rune and Bryce, who are very closely tied to the Fae origins in Midgard, because they are descended from the original Starborn that came to Midgard, and we have Rune, who possibly owns a part of the Dread Trove. So I'm not saying it's not going to happen, I'm just saying that I don't personally think it is going to happen, because it would be gimmicky, it would be fan servicey, and while that is currently happening in ACOTAR, I don't think it's going to happen in Crescent City. Sarah J. Maas has said it's its own story taking place in its own world. I feel like she's kind of going to be sabotaging herself by making everything dependent on everything else, especially as the original trilogy of ACOTAR and Throne of Glass were published as young adult. So she will have a lot of new readers coming into her work now who don't want to read young adult and just want to read House of Earth and Blood, and she would be losing a whole ton of people by not doing that. But she's an incredibly popular author, one of the most popular female fantasy authors that is around today and in like the prime of her writing career. So I think that she can actually get away with stuff like that because of who she is. I just really hope that that is not the direction that this is going to go in. I want them to be separate. I want to continue gaining all of this lore and the tidbits, but I definitely don't want all of the series to be dependent on each other. So there you have it. That was my attempt at unraveling some of the Maas Multiverse. As I mentioned, this is definitely not everything. I know that there's like possibilities that Kashai, the brother to the Bone Carver and the Weaver, is possibly in another world. Possibly he was trapped in the Throne of Glass world, and we maybe saw a glimpse of that in Hour of Fire. There's also kind of references to a cat and darkness and shadows in the library in A Court of Silver Flames that possibly references Adis. And like I said, I do think that hell is a recurring thing that is the same throughout all of these series, just in different manifestations. If there is a whole ton of new information uncovered in House of Sky and Breath, then I will possibly make a follow-up to this video, tie in some of those points into these points, possibly make it a series depending on how much material there is. But down in the comments, please let me know your guys' series. Do you think we're gonna have a major crossover, or do you think, like me, that it's all just additional lore and history that ties the series together? But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. I do have Crescent City candles in stock at the minute as well. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.